Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to your flipped classroom. And I know it's a late posting, and I apologize about it. But look, I'm going to keep it under 17 minutes, right? We're going to keep this nice and short and stuff like that. And we are here to talk about the modernization of Russia, right? And I'm going to finish up grading y'all's exams probably tonight and stuff like that. So they'll probably be posted. And your grades will be updated probably by Monday morning, okay? But go ahead and keep an eye out for those things and stuff like that. So far in my checking, y'all are doing very, very well. So I'm very, very proud. So keep up the good work, right? So speaking of keeping up the good work and all the good content and stuff like that, let's dive head first into talking about the modernization of Russia and the Ottoman. Well, really not so much the Ottoman. We're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire for about like 8 seconds, right? And we're going to talk about them like right now, okay? So the big thing about it that you need to understand when it looks like the Ottoman and Russia during the mid-1800s, coming off the heels of the revolutions of 1848, coming off the heels of all the reform movements and stuff like that that went down in Europe, right? Coming off of all of that, coming off of everybody else's second industrial revolution, Russia and the Ottoman are a little bit behind, right? They're a little bit behind because both of them are massive empires, right? That are filled with tons of different ethnic groups of people, and they're dominated by one particular militarized or racial group, right? So, and what I mean by that is the Russians controlled all the land that was known at the time as Russia, even though people that aren't even Russian live under them. You have Ukrainians, you have Belarusians, you have Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, and all these other people that live underneath them as well, but everybody was forced to speak Russian, just kind of like a very, very similar Austrian Empire kind of thing, right? Ottomans, very, very similar, right? We've got Middle Easterners and stuff, or like Turks, like we have Ottoman Turks who are like are Muslim empires and stuff like that, ruling over places like the Greeks, right? Like so, which have been like historically and culturally very European for thousands of years. Well, the thing that you need to know about this though is out of the two of them, right? Out of Russia and the Ottoman is the weaker of the two, right? The Ottoman is crumbling. A lot of their territories are beginning to nationalize, right? Places like Serbia, Greece, Algeria, right? All these other little areas, even though Algeria was eventually lost to France, but Ottoman used to own Algeria, right? The Ottoman Empire used to be massive, right? It used to span all of North Africa, all of the Balkans, a huge chunk of the Middle East, all of modern-day Turkey, and then as well expanding all the way into places as far as Iran, right? And they also used to actually expand under one of their greatest leaders, right? One of their greatest leaders was a leader from the 16th century. His name was Suleiman the Great, right? Who has a very, very awesome onion-style hat right there. But as that leader, though, when Suleiman the Great brought them to their height, when they expanded over northern Africa into the Balkans and as far west as Iran, following that, they're going to start crumbling. And a lot of that has to do with their inability to control the people that were underneath them, the inability to control an empire so massive, and then also their inability to modernize, right? So the thing about it is that Russia is going to attempt to modernize for a second time after an engagement they get into with the Ottomans, right? As the Ottomans are beginning to crumble, the Russians are going to see this as an opportunity to gobble up a lot of Ottoman land, right? They're going to be like, ooh, the Ottoman is failing. Let's go take this and this and this and this and this and this. That's going to freak a lot of Europeans out. Europeans are going to kind of get together, bot Russia in the nose and tell them to calm down like you would to a dog, right? And then it's going to lead Russia to being like, maybe we should modernize a little bit. But the big thing about it, though, is that's the massive theme we're talking about here, right? Is Russia's attempt to modernize, okay? So continuing the modernization of Russia, you have to understand, going into what we're talking about, what the state of Russian affairs were like, okay? So about 90% of the population of Russia at the time lived off the land, right? In the sense of the fact that even the nobles had farms and stuff like that that still resembled what you would believe to be almost like a Middle Ages economy, right? They still had feudalism, very, very, very huge effect here, right? Feudalism was so massively used by Russian boyars and Russian nobles to continually create food, create like different economic systems. They weren't necessarily really like that economically advanced, right? St. Petersburg was a massive trade capital, but the rest of Russia, which spanned all the way to Siberia and then all the way into Eastern Europe, was still very agrarian, right? Extremely agrarian. And if you were not wealthy in agrarian, like you were very poor in agrarian. And feudalism, like I said, is still very much in effect. 80% of the population by this point in Russia, around the 1850s, is going to be serfs, right? Like serfs are 80% of the population in Russia, okay? And I said serfs, right? We got growing working classes going on in the rest of Western Europe, factory classes blowing up in places like Great Britain, but then you got 80% of Russia is serfs, all right? So like now that is going to kind of like mirror or show you a lot of big things coming down the pipe, right? And a lot of these big things are going to be like, well, if you got a lot of serfs, you probably don't have a lot of railroads. If you got a lot of serfs, you probably don't have a lot of port cities, right? If you got a lot of serfs, you're probably not as modern as the rest of the other places, right? Another huge reason why the revolutions of 1848 never affected Russia, because the serfs can't collectivize like that. They don't know how to get together and hold a small revolution. They're not educated enough and stuff like that. And the thing about it is also something else you need to understand is that even though the nobles were in power in Russia, it was still very politically tumultuous, right? As in, we have a lot of nobles that really don't really like the czars, and we have a lot of czar nobles that don't really like these other nobles that are liberal nobles, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. And a lot of different groups are fighting for power in Russia. Now, not actively fighting, they're not actually meeting each other in the streets, like in the revolutions of 1848 and fighting each other and punching each other in the face, but there's a lot of big events that kind of demonstrate what's going on in Russia. And one of the biggest ones is this thing called the Decembrist Revolt, right? And the Decembrist Revolt happened early on in 1825. It kind of just shows us that going into the 1850s and 1860s, that Russia's in a bad way. They just don't even realize how bad it is, right? So if what ended up happening is there were actually two sons that were supposed to inherit the throne of, like, Russia, right? Following the reign of Tsar Alexander I, okay? So the thing about it is after Tsar Alexander I dies, he's got two sons. He's got Constantine and Nicholas, right? A lot of nobles and a lot of military officers want Constantine to take over because he's liberal and progressive and educated, and they think he's going to do a lot of great stuff for Russia. But then Constantine doesn't tell anybody, but he's like, I don't really want to be czar. And he abdicates the throne and hands it over to his very conservative, extreme, holy shenanigans, let's keep Russia the way it's always been, brother, Nicholas I, right? And Nicholas I is the grandfather of Nicholas II, right? Okay, the famous Romanov who was the last Romanov, right? But Nicholas I is very, very aggressive and conservative. Well, the other military leaders and a bunch of nobles didn't know that Constantine kind of relaxingly abdicated the throne, so they assembled into a giant square, right, where they were all then summarily shot by Nicholas' conservative military, right? So as you can tell right here, we have a lot of issues going on. We got certain people that are supporting certain czars and not others and things like that. We have the liberal conservative pulling and stretching in a lot of different ways going on in Russia as well. It's just not as politically like big and grandiose. We don't have barricades in the streets in Russia because we just don't have that many streets in Russia because they're just not that modern, right? Now, there's a big thing going on, though, in the 1850s that's very, very important, okay? So getting into that, Nicholas I comes into power as of 1825, right? Now, while he's in power, though, instead of realizing that Russia's not very modern and they're not keeping up with the rest of Europe, he instead decides to kind of go in the progression of old school thinking. And he's kind of like, you know what we need? We need more ports and stuff like that, right? So like he actually decides rather than building railroads and building factories and building industrial things that will continue to bring Russia into the modern light, he decides that he wants to try and go gobble up some coastal territories in the Black Sea, right? And so he wants to wage war on the falling, crumbling Ottoman Empire, right? As the Ottoman Empire is fading away, Nicholas I is the guy that comes along. He's like, ooh, let's go fight a war in Crimea, and we're going to make up a bullcrap reason as to why we're going to go over there and fight it, all right? And we're going to go over there, and we're going to take a bunch of land and territory from the Ottomans, growing Russia to be at its zenith, its biggest, like, landmass it's ever been, and we're going to freak everybody else in Europe out, right? Now, Nicholas II claimed that he was going to the Crimean region to protect the Christians, right? So, like, the thing about it that you need to understand is that in this eastern territory of the Ottoman Empire, well, the northern territory of the Ottoman Empire, the eastern territories of Europe, there were a lot of old Christian sites, and there were also a lot of Eastern Orthodox Christians that lived under Ottoman control, right? Now, according to Nicholas I, it was his job as the Russian Tsar to go out there and protect those people, right? Protect them from the Ottomans and their oppressive rule and their Muslim rule, and keep them from being disenfranchised and and prevent the destruction of Christian shrines, right? So he goes off and tries to start this war in this region of the Crimea, right? But in reality, let's talk about the real reason why he wanted to go and fight it, because if the Ottoman Empire is falling all to pieces, you can eventually take over the entire area known as the Black Sea, right? And if you take over the Black Sea, you now control the eastern trade routes of the Mediterranean, the same trade routes that run through the Dardanelles Strait right here, past Constantinople, and literally were the things that Venice made all of its money off of going into the Renaissance, right? So the Black Sea and these trade routes were very profitable. And so Nicholas wanted to take a lot of these territories as the Ottoman Empire is beginning to fall apart. Well, the thing about it, though, is that a lot of other people out in Europe aren't having this, right? And ironically enough, when this Crimean War goes down, France, Britain, Spain, Italy, all these other people go to support the Ottoman, right? They actually go to support the Ottoman, leaving Russia out in the cold. You like that joke? Because Russia's cold. Now, the big thing about it, though, is they leave Russia out in the cold due to the fact that they don't want Russia to become this giant power. So to conserve the balance of power, they want the Ottoman to stay alive because they have always served as this like bulwark or this like big speed bump to Russia, holding them back and preventing them from expand to be too large, right? Now, there's an interesting couple of things about this, though. You would think that Russia would have some allies in this, like, the Austrians, right? The Russians went in and helped suppress the Hungarian revolts in 1848 for Franz Joseph, the Austrian emperor. So you'd think that, like, the Austrians would be like, yes, we'll come and help you, Russia, because we're friends and pals and buddies. But actually, interestingly enough, the Austrians declared themselves neutral. So did the Prussians, right? Now, and they actually refused to help the Russians whatsoever. Now, because of this is going to leave Russia fighting this war by themselves against the Ottoman, the French, the English, and the Northern Italians as well, and even some Spanish forces. So with that, though, Russia is going to get blown out of this war, right? Crimean War blows the doors off of Russia. They lose 200,000 soldiers and 200,000 lives in a very, very crusty war due to the fact that serfs, one, aren't allowed in the army in Russia, right? Because feudalism is still such a factor. Well, serfs aren't allowed in the army, so that means 80% of your population can't be in the military. Nice. Real good job there, Russian nobles. Makes great sense right there. Also, their technology is just not quite up to par. The rest of the countries are using rifled muskets, whereas the Russians are using unrifled muskets, right? And we'll talk about what that means a little bit in class. We'll talk about this in when we review. I'll be like, what's the difference between the Russian soldiers' guns and everybody else's guns? We'll talk about what rifling versus unrifling means. Now, also, the other big thing about it as well is that Russia had an extremely outdated infrastructure. They didn't even have proper roads that got to the Crimean and stuff like that. And when they had to bring up supplies, they're bringing them up in horses and wagons, while the rest of the other countries in Europe are bringing things to the front lines via railroad, right? Which is much more efficient and stuff like that. The result is the fact that Russia realizes, good Lord, we are so out of date. Now that is the major result, is when they get waxed in this war, and I mean absolutely waxed in this war, they realize we are so behind. We are so behind the times, and we need to get back in this. Now, the funny thing about it is you would think that Tsar Nicholas I, the guy that started this whole war, would be the guy that realizes that, but he doesn't, because he's dead. He actually dies in 1855, a year before the Crimean War actually ends, right? And his son takes over, Alexander II, right? Now, fun facts about the Crimean War as well is that Florence Nightingale is a famous nurse that was there, actually, and she kind of is known as the mother of modern nursing, and she actually realized checking on patients and stuff like that at night, and then all these other different things are going to be the way to actually keep soldiers from dying in their beds in the middle of the night. But she was actually there at the Crimean War. There's also a very famous poem by Lord Alfred Tennyson called The Charge of the Light Brigade and Into Death Valley. And a lot of people actually relate that to LSU's football stadium, which is actually kind of cool. So the big thing about it, though, is Alexander II, the Romanov king, takes over, the next Romanov king. He is the eldest son of Nicholas I, and he pledges to modernize Russia, right? His big thing is we got to modernize Russia. We got to make this country better, make it more stable, make it more effective, right? And so he enters into the great Russian reforms. And the biggest thing he does going out the gate is he abolishes serfdom. In 1861, Alexander II comes in, following the end of the Crimean War, creates a very, very large manifesto, and he abolishes serfdom with the Emancipation of the Serfs Act of 1861. He comes in and he frees all people from human bondage. All privately owned serfs must be freed, and all state-owned serfs must be freed as well. That's right, the Russian government even had serfs at this point. They would all be freed. Now, if you're a historian and you really look into this manifesto, there's this 49 years of repayment thing and blah, 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 blah. There was all this other crazy stuff that happened. But he was known as the lion liberator of all of the Russian czars and stuff like that. And he came in and he did this for a reason, right? He was our serf system is slowing us down. So if we want to create factories and stuff like that, the serfs wouldn't even be allowed to leave their land and go work in said factories, right? So the first step to industrialization is to end serfdom, right? He does come in and do that, which is a massive reform. Now, it kind of bites him in the butt because it's not as reformist as people had hoped. Serfs got about half the land, but the thing about it is they're going to collectivize that land, making almost communist-style groups and stuff like that. As you can see, as these happy serfs right here are going to reap wheat together rather than actually doing it independently. They actually collectivized it in their towns and stuff. So only about 50% of the serfs even started moving towards cities that would have been able to become an actual factory working class period. Also, he abolished capital punishment, which was an amazing step forward, right? That's a huge reformist thing. And also, the other big thing is he created local governments, right? Now, this is another thing that's not as reformist as people had hoped. He created these little town councils called Zemstvos, and where these were where elected people were hoping that they could, there were town councils basically, and everybody was hoping that maybe eventually the Zemstvos will all get together and they'll form a legislative body that Russia's never had, right? The British had the Parliament, the Chamber of Deputies in France, like the Frankfurt Parliament. Everybody else has got legislative bodies, but Russia never had one. And they were hoping that these town councils would eventually form into one giant one. But they never really did. And they kind of just stalled out. The biggest positives of the entire thing is that equality before the law was brought in. Russian Jews were actually treated much more fairly for now. All right, so we'll get into how that kind of takes a catastrophic turn a little bit later on in the late 1800s. Censorship was heavily stepped down, and Russia would attempt to modernize and industrialize by creating factories and building up some of these cities and actually trying to invite outside investors to come and invest in the cheap labor that would exist in Russia, basically creating an outsourcing model, right? Trying to get English investors to create factories in Russia, trying to get French investors to create factories in Russia. Didn't really work out as well as everybody had hoped, though, because there are two waves of modernization in Russia, okay? The thing about it is this first wave that we're talking about right now, the one under Alexander that's going to be going down underneath his rule, and in the 1860s, he's going to subsidize railways to create them as many as possible. He's going to build up these railroads as big as possible. His infrastructure is going to bring new raw materials and the development of that factory class as other Europeans come in to try and invest in the cheap labor that will be in Russia. But the negative lurking in the background is that many of these serfs or former serfs go to become factory workers. They never kind of move their way up into the middle class, so you have a giant group of workers known as the proletariat. We'll talk about that a little bit in class as well. It basically is just a fancy word for worker. And you also have a shaky foundation of instability because the gap between the wealthy and the poor in Russia is going to be massive, right? And the other big reason why a lot of these things never went fully through is because Tsar Alexander II would be assassinated, right? He would be assassinated and rule would pass to his conservative brother, Alexander III, that would stop a lot of these reforms, right? Now, the big thing about it is we'll talk about that assassination story and this really, really pretty church that was built where he was assassinated tomorrow in class, okay? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.